Hey folks, we're going to start up. How many of you have never been to Fordham University before? I see it's about 1/3 of you. My name's Harold Jakushian. I have a class, so I'll be leaving. But Alan Bear has been having all these dynamic sessions here at Fordham, and he'll be introducing our speaker. I would just mention that in 2 days, on October 18th, we'll be having an Armenian town hall here at Fordham. I left the information on the table there if that interests you. Or you could speak with Armenian Georgia, who's one of our organizers of the Armenian Town Hall, Attorney Armenian Georgia. I wish you good luck. And
thank you, President.
I wish you good luck. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. As Harold Gevorkyan mentioned, I'm Berber, the President of the Armenian Engineers. And tonight we have the honor of having our long-standing member, Professor Aleksandr Gevorkyan. So a little bit about the AESA. We've been around in the New York, New Jersey area for the past 9 years. And we'll be celebrating our 9th anniversary this year. Actually on November 10th, we'll have a banquet out in Little Lake, New York. And you guys are all welcome to join us. If you'd like to have more information, let me know. And we host, lectures on a monthly basis. And of course, our mentoring forum, which will be in February, March next year. Now I'd like to introduce our lecture chair, Aleksandr Gevorkyan, and I'll be introducing the speaker.
Okay, I'm going to speak in Armenian. First, I'm Նյութը էկոնոմիի մասին է, քանի օքի էկոնոմիին հայերեն է։ Բրավո։ Ես։ Ուրեմն բիრი խոսի հետ խորհրդային տնտեսակցության մասին, ուրեմն մանավանդ Եվրոպայի մեջ եւ ներկայիս ասիական երկրներում մեջ կորուպցիա։ Ես Ալեք ուրիշ սեվով ակտիվացնամ։ Ալեկը ուրեմն եկիմուսուցիչս նույն շրջաններն է։ Կերպացրել որ շրջաններն է Ալեկը։ Ռոստովանდა։ Հայերեն օրոքի Ռոստովդոնինգա։ Հայերեն։ Նորնախիչևը։ Ասալ է։ Ռոստովը ուրեմն նորգելը։ I'll move to English, so sorry for those of you who don't understand. But Alek and I share a friend, or I don't know how to say it in English, but the principal of my high school, I'm from Beirut, I went to an Armenian high school there, and the principal was Simon Varatsian, the father of Simon Varatsian. He was the 4th Prime Minister of the First Republic of Armenia, and he is from Nornakhichevan. So Alek has the distinct honor of being a compatriot of a very famous man. So I'm not going to steal the thunder, I'll let him speak, but if you want any write-ups, there's one that we created, there are several that he created. Just in closing, I'll tell you this is our 5th lecture series, and we're going to have a 6th one 2 months from now, December 6th. Something boarding on mathematics, which is something that interests me very much, astrophysics. And we have a student called David Vartanyan, who is a PhD student right now in Princeton University, his last year, so 50 PhD student. And he's going to talk about supernova and black holes. So really fantastic stuff. And he knows, his father knows apparently Victor Hampatsumyan. We've all heard of Victor Hampatsumyan. So I encourage all of you to come here December 6th, again 6 to 8 p.m. The only caveat is the room is always TBD, it could be changed. Whatever room number we have there, don't worry about it, check at the entrance and you'll find the room. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming. So the flyers, what I have is just flyers about the book, and the talk is structured around the book, which we're trying to show here. You can come and take a look at it later. Thank you for the introduction, Rob. Thank you, Alan, for inviting in Mr. Kushin, because Fordham has become, having AESA, coming to AESA events at Fordham has become one of the things to do in the community. And I really enjoy a lot of, it's one of those academic venues, which we don't really have much. We have a lot about politics, culture, current events, but there are very few organizations that do something around science, something related to academic work, and have tolerance for speakers to present on those topics. So this is I only wish more success, and I'm happy to see it grow. But I know everyone's been staring at this picture for the past 40 minutes. What's up with that? So this was the original title, but then I thought, well, maybe I need to calm down myself with this whole academic focus and kind of talk about something that may be easier to relate to. But it is an important aspect of the part of the world that I'll be talking about. And I'll be talking about the Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, and so inevitably we'll, I'm sure, talk about Armenia and Armenia's economy, so we have a few things on that. But the Beatles were instrumental in breaking the whole thing down. And we have time, if we have the desire to, we can watch the video. But it's the fact that the Beatles existed and the fact that they were not allowed behind the what people refer to Iron Curtain, which was not, by the way, Churchill's invention. I'll get back to that. And it's the fact that people were trying to proactively learn about the Beatles, and it's coincidentally just a couple of weeks ago, one of the leading Beatles fan of the Soviet Union, Fordham University, passed away, and he was sort of at the avant-garde of the whole movement culturally, and sort of working in the underground. And then later, after the 1990s, he would become more of a mainstream fixture. But there's research into this subject, and it's quite influential. And if we did, I think, and there are books being written on this, but I talk about this to my students for way longer. But let's move on. So what I want to talk about is that I already saw some of the surprise faces. Is that, well, there's perception and there's reality. I will have a lot of graphs to try to kind of go both ways, but one reality is that this part of the world is just an element, is a component of a bigger, broader field of economic development. We tend to view country-related issues as just one specific isolated case, but in fact, they're part of a system. So this requires a systemic view, but with attention to country details. And what I try to do specifically in the book, which just came out a few months ago, is focus on this merger of economic history and policy. But if you were to ask me what kind of pushed me into this, by training I'm an economist, I should probably start with that. I teach at St. John's University. Before that, I adjuncted across the world in New York City, Columbia, NYU, many other places. And I worked in consulting, and then I was a senior economist at the City Council. So now I'm only at St. John's, and on occasion I sit in for the United Nations mission of the Vatican on the economic topics. But what I've been doing all the time over the past 10, 15 years is giving lectures, and most of them somehow ending up talking about the transition experience. And every once in a while there would be a question, well, why is this a problem to begin with? Why didn't they just flip a switch and say, you were in socialism, now you're in capitalism? So that kind of was the last sort of point of no return for me, that I said, okay, I need to sit down and work on something more complete. So just to be sure, this is the world we're looking at, okay, and this is how it looks. The map and the scale are all right. If you're not finding some of the countries, that's also important to keep in mind. So again, we spent, with students, I spent probably 40 minutes just on this one map. and we talk about the significance of geography, which is also culture, which is the scale, and then bring in the history in an introductory lecture, but I'll skip that. We're more or less familiar with things. So the first myth to destroy, I guess, is that there was no transition. In economic literature, and if you read some of the high-level analysis from the World Bank and so on, of the past, but not exclusively to World Bank. In fact, there's been a lot of soul searching there, but just in general. The reference to that part of the world is as transition economies. And so I chose the title to use that in the title of the book as well, so that I can make a clear reference about what I'm talking about. But there was no transition. Okay, I've been through enough corporate jobs to know what transition is. You do your boss's job for 2 years, and then you move on to your boss's position. That's a transition. You already know what you're doing. In this case, there was no such thing. It was a fundamental change from top to bottom and then bottom to the top. Everything was absolutely new. And that's why I kind of emphasized the focus on history. So, a beautiful landscape and all the buzzwords of the time. The focus was on building export-led industries, entrepreneurship, privatization, by all means, liberalization, and so on. All good things, by the way, but we'll get to some of the nuances later. Focus on breaking down the big governments, and so on. In macroeconomics, so just to clarify, there's very little common sense. There's a lot of technical analysis, technical work, and these words fit into that technical analysis and those technical models. But as John Maynard Keynes, who was one of the famed economists of the 20th century, mentioned, hardly anything else but the economists and maybe political economists who influence the politicians. So keep that in mind. Now, what happened? Well, if we just think about, I try to keep it simple, but if we just keep this as the beginning of the times, 1990, this was the level of living standards. For the rest of the 90s, the living standards declined significantly and only climbed up to the 1990 level in early 2000s. So it took more than a decade for this group collectively, and then the country stories that are very interesting, but for the group collectively to climb back to where they were, where they had started in terms of income levels, right? So that's already cannot be transition because this must be something else going on there. In the book, I use a lot of statements from famous people. From Churchill, I borrowed 2 or 3 of them. And this one I used in the chapter where there was a discussion of the war economy, 1940s and so on. And it's quite interesting. We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us. So when the Soviet system and socialist system would become formalized in the post-war year, in the 1940s, it would be a system that would be then transplanted into the Eastern Europe and then kind of solidified across the republics of the Soviet Union. But then something interesting happens. At its peak, when it was at its peak of its power, sort of economic and ideological, in the early 80s, it was roughly 16% of the global economy. Right? So if we think the global economy is 100, then the 16 pieces of that pie whereas the combined Eastern European and Soviet economies. And then there was a drop, a decline, and then by the 90s it was even further decline, and now it stayed the same at roughly 6%. If you think about the countries that most of us can relate to, Armenia and Georgia, well, they're somewhere here below 1%. Okay, so the scale and the size of the map also matters in economic sense, and that's very important to keep in mind. What puzzles a lot of people is what happened actually here, from the top levels to down, and the explanation seems to be about not being able to reinvest, basically, put the money into technological development. If there was some attempt to do so in the early 70s and through the 80s, then things might have been different. And so there was a question earlier, was it inevitable, the transition? And the answer may have been, well, yes, it could have been inevitable. If the change was if that investment was made. And there are a couple of interesting papers that have come out on this topic, some of them very specific and very technical. There's another theory in economics, it's a big view, and nothing big happens without a Russian mathematician or statistician, right? So Kondratev, Nikolai Kondratev came up with the Kondratev waves idea. He suggested, he did this all by hand, right? It was in the 1920s. He calculated how countries transform, develop over a period of time. He found that it takes about 50 to 70 years for a major breakdown. And if we think about it this way, Soviet industrialization happened in early 1930s or so, right? And then the Eastern European industrialization happens in late 40s, 1950s. Then this is roughly the period of time when we should have expected a change. And it also then is consistent with when Gorbachev comes to power and says more socialism, right? The idea was not to break down the country or whatever system, but was to reinforce it. It was already too late at that time. Talking about reinforcement and maintaining the solid system, it was a very hierarchical system, right? Politically, there was the general secretary, the people making the decisions, the Politburo, a bunch of ministries, and it's all centralized top-down. The further east you would go, the more centralized it would be. So the former Soviet Union, in that sense, was restricted, but Central Asia, for example, was even more restricted than the Caucasus. But of course, most liberal would be Hungary, Czech Republic. And that's also something that is very important. And the reason why I emphasize this, because economists tend to generalize. And that's one of the problems that we get as consumers of economics news or economic analysis. We don't realize that the person who wrote up a short blog saying they're all the same just generalized very different experiences. And so that's important for what's happening right now as well. But in terms of standardization and making the system solid, this is just a typical Soviet development, right? There's a story when the guy gets drunk, gets on the plane and ends up in a different city. Even the key works to a wrong apartment, right? So I mentioned that in the book. But that was the style of organization. It's also something about industrial organization, business organization. It was easier to produce standardized things. It was too complicated to reinvest and come up with a different toothpaste, which was probably what was needed at some point. But in terms of industrialization, one of the biggest projects, of course, was the railroad, which was just recently completed, but started back in the Tsar's time. And in Eastern Europe, industrialization went full speed right after the war, World War II. These pictures basically show the averages, and so these numbers are just the average investment. In other words, if you have $100, where it would go, showing that most of it went into the industrial sector. So at first, in 1940s, 1945, it was not really clear, unlike what we maybe think or we think we know, it wasn't really clear what the destiny of what became known as Eastern Europe would be. We have to appreciate the fact of the resistance parties that were fighting against the Nazis, and then as the Soviet army advanced, they joined in the same struggle. Those resistance parties would become very popular, and Yugoslavia was one really good example, with Tito, who rose in the ranks and became sort of the guarantor of the country's stability, which then falls apart after his death in the 1980s. But by the time through the local elections, the socialists went up. That's when it became more crystal clear that the world is going to be divided into two. So to win the hearts then of that region, which was mostly agricultural, other than Czech Republic, not even Czechoslovakia, but just the Czech Republic, the Soviet Union kind of pushed with the funding. Similar to Marshall Plan in Western Europe, the Soviet Union pushed with funding in terms of industrialization. This is a very important fact which explains why Czech Republic is Czech Republic and Armenia is Armenia, for example. I will get that question, I know. But I know I will get it in comparison to another country, so I'll keep that for now. So this has to be appreciated. It came to a situation where if Poland had a steel factory built, Romania would say we need that too, simply because Poland has it. And this requires funding, capital funds, specialists, and people to kind of build all these things. And it was kind of provided out of that solidarity spirit. Well, but then the difference comes later. Again, maybe difficult to read the numbers, but just I'll describe you, and it says up there in the caption. For the Soviet Union, most of the foreign trade was concentrated within the socialist bloc. So there was a CMEA, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, right? And that included Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. And so primarily, there were other countries, but primarily those. And so that's where most of the trade occurred. But for Eastern Europe, things were slightly more relaxed. They had access to developed nations' markets, primarily Western European, Germany, France, Austria, those countries and their businesses. This would also become very important later on when things start to break apart and countries and politicians, governments have to make the decisions which way to go. What explains the success of, let's say, Hungary or East Germany or Czech Republic integrating with European Union's economy, it was partially the history that all that was already known, and there's been a pattern of that. Of course, the Berlin Wall collapses, torn down in 1989, and that's a great symbolical event. There was probably that and the perestroika announcement a few years before that pretty much if the bills rocked the Kremlin, those two announcements kind of toppled it completely. More recently, and again, if we look at the country patterns, all you need to know is the difference in colors here. And this line, which basically is the living standard level of 1989, right, around the time of Berlin Wall collapse. Anything that's in dark, that means they're way below, and this is for the year of 2000, they're way below in terms of their income per capita, per person, as early or as late as 2000. And they only catch up by 2016, some of them, and not all of them, and not evenly so, and some are still remaining below their living standard of 1989. And then I verified this several times, and there are other people writing similar things, and that's the puzzle. So if it was a transition, if we were to refer to it as a successful economic transition, well, what is the problem, right? And this diversity of experiences must be appreciated. Now, economists until now try to explain this as the differences in how intense the reforms were. But if we compare Uzbekistan to Czech Republic, the intensity of reforms really doesn't matter there, because structurally, institutionally, and culturally, those are two different countries. They have access to different markets. And the same would apply to the case of the Caucasus, Armenia and Georgia, and the connections there. So that's interesting. I'll skip this one, too many numbers. More recently, I guess there's a slight, I have pictures there. But more recently, there's slight improvement in the social indicators, such as unemployment and so on. But the thing is, most of it erupted again in the early 90s, and that's something to keep in mind. What this shows is the share of inequality, and I'll have another picture on this. Some of the significant numbers are the poverty levels, right? And these are official poverty levels, which means any alternative estimates might come up with even higher levels. So these are kind of a mixed bunch of improvements and problems. Another thing with perception, again, more recently, is the whole story of shadow economy. And again, Armenian audience mostly. So Armenia is often compared to Georgia. Well, another country which I like because I have very good friends there. But the record is not as linear as we might think about it. Georgia may be doing, so the lower the number is, the better. Georgia may be doing better in some of the categories, but Armenia is doing also more or less okay in others. And by the way, both countries compared to the Europe, Central Asia average, or all countries, are actually better in terms of the shadow economy perception, in terms of actual interference of the government sector and so on into the economy. So if we think things are bad in Armenia, looks like they're much worse somewhere else. So that is something to appreciate, but I'll come back to this point in a moment. So quickly about the book, right? It's generally this study of economic history with those kind of anecdotal kind of discussions, just like what I mentioned about the mixing of the apartments. There was reference to history a lot, and trying to weave in that with the technical conversation on the changes, the economic changes. In terms of the structure, there are 2 introductory chapters, and I'll mention a couple of things about that a bit more. Specifically, I try to understand what is it that we're talking about in terms of transition, and I come back to the transformation. But which is a big point for me there. And then I start with 1861, which is a symbolical year for both the Russian Empire back then and the United States. It was actually I was looking for a starting point, and usually when economists try to describe something about that world, they refer to 1917 as the starting point, as the October Revolution. But I found there's much more deeper history in 1861. There's a very well-known and influential economist who was some time ago, Aleksandr Gevorkyan, and he wrote that if we want to understand Russia's economy today, we need to first and foremost understand Russia's history. Something like that, I'm paraphrasing. So that's why I go back and talk about the industrialization, how kind of different scenarios that history presented, but history just is something that happens, it's a fact. So there may have been different scenarios, but this is what actually happened. Then talk about the war and World War II reconstruction, and then introducing Eastern European experiences in this overall discussion. So there are only 10 chapters, and then the rest is kind of the socialist model. There was something interesting about the Yugoslavian model, Hungary, and that would become known as market socialism. Unlike the Soviet countries, the Soviet republics, Hungary had a 2-tier banking, which means there was a private bank and there was something what we would probably refer to today as private bank. Unlike the socialist economies in the former Soviet Union, Hungary and Poland, to some extent, but Yugoslavia definitely, they had a price mechanism, at least in the consumer markets, which was not really there because prices were centralized within the big Soviet plan. And unlike anyone else, Yugoslavia experimented with workers' management. Workers were part of the board, of the company board, and they had rights to vote on production plans, profit distribution, and things like this. So the experiences of those countries were profoundly different. The ideology may have been similar and the same in many ways and influential, but the economic experience, which is what happens in reality to you, and I think that's what's more important, were very different, which is why when transition happens, the 1990s, we get these different answers. So that's the liberalization, privatization, shock therapy. Then there's discussion on human inequality and more or less present scenarios of how things are now. And yeah, I should tell you, the initial project was 15 chapters. I have to stop somewhere. I use a lot of these things. I love them. I mean, on the poverty and inequality, I use Mikhail Kalecki, a famous Polish economist, who said, an increase in the number of paupers does not broaden the market. Something to think about, right? Or Hegel, who said that the aim by itself is a lifeless universal. And the bare result is the corpse which has left the guiding tendency behind it. Something to think about it. So here's we've reached this point, but that's it. What matters is how we reach that point. But okay, let's talk about this. I know, everyone was waiting for that. So recently I was invited to speak on just that part at the panel. Do you And we had an interesting conversation, interesting panel. So I had to prepare a few points, but here's my difficulty. If we're interested in Armenia's situation post-revolution, there isn't really much in terms of the economy. There's a lot of politics. So these are bits and pieces of information pulled together, and I tried to update it for tonight. There's a program that the government released, and that's great. At least it's something specific and concrete. And there are a couple of general statements which are also welcome, and they should be there. First is the establishing competitive market and the fight against monopolies, fight against shadow economy, and then have a tangible social effect of economic development, meaning reducing poverty, reducing inequality, increasing employment. Those are all great. Every other government in Armenia has had the same kind of statement included in their publications and their economic programs. Now, how they achieve this? Well, there are three specific sectors that I mentioned. There's high tech, there's agriculture, and tourism. I think the high tech deserves some attention because it seems to be the one that will save the country. Let's just keep in mind that, and please, so the engineers will know this better than me, but it is roughly, it's roughly employing 15,000 people right now, and it's more or less 2 or 3% of GDP. It's growing at 20%. It's growing at 20%, but it's more like no more than 5% of GDP.
6.5. I'm arguing.
Okay, fine. We can look at different data sources, but it's not something that will save the country. It's not ever. But we'll come back to this. I'll come back to this.
We're going to have a conversation. Okay.
So another sector is agriculture, which is great, fantastic, but agriculture must be intensive, okay, not extensive. The Soviet type of agriculture was extensive. It was collectivized agriculture. Poland maintained its private agriculture. Almost 90% of Polish farms were still private, even during the Soviet time, which is another big difference. So there was focus on intensive agriculture, in other words, being productive on the little lot of land that we have. And then tourism, again, these are niche markets, okay, and Armenia is not that simple to get to. I've tried to bring several conferences there. One that I'm participating in now, we organize every year, is the Armenian Economics Association, but that's, again, very specific to Armenians. But the bigger conferences, they tend to go to warmer climates and direct flights to places. So, in any case, there was something else. Oh yeah, so the person who resigned recently mentioned that in addition to this, there's light industry growth, which is, I think, more sensible because that talks about domestic market. So if we look at these now, high tech requires high skill and some sort of preparation before you jump into this. There's a reason why we have coding for whatever century, coding for sustainability. There are all these organizations. That means they take the kids, take the students, and they educate them, they teach them how to code, if we just think about high tech as coding. But the significance of Armenia's IT industry compared to others is that there is novelty. There's a lot of new products that are being offered to the market, not the consumer market, but something that goes inside of the devices and the apps. Right? It's not something that catches the headlines. But there is market, but it is, again, limited to, I mean, as great as they are, but limited to those inventions. So if we want to make this broader, even if it's 6%, it is still not large enough.
6.5.
I'll give you 7.
About 7.
I'll give you 7 and I'll double my number, but it's still not enough. Because it's you need to make it sustainable. To make it sustainable, Tuomo is an example, but you need to have those type of initiatives on the ongoing rolling basis. In other words, there shouldn't be any interruption. So there's only one answer: investing in education more and more. And the initiatives that AESA is doing, for example, are great. Agriculture, well, the only market really that is meaningful for agriculture is the Eurasian Union. And the moment the borders open, then other agricultural products will just move in and take over local producers. So these are all very difficult questions. I mean, we all wish success and prosperity, but you have to be realistic, not emotional. That's the point I'm trying to make. So the light industry is actually what is growing out of a niche, but is probably something that is more sustainable because it employs relatively medium-skilled workforce. So it could create jobs and could help grow domestic industry. All the others are either too specialized or somewhat closed for majority of people to move into. I mean, we can't have a country of just taxi drivers, right? So there's that. I'll skip the numbers, but there's just various trends that may be interesting. There was speculative trend, there was anticipation in the early parts of the year, but the data is changing, and so it's very, very recent, right? One interesting thing is that the consumption went up, and that was kind of an anticipation of that expecting some sort of a deficit or crisis looming, something like that. I think it's important to keep, again, in the context of Armenia, the large business, which is also diaspora-driven and diaspora initiatives, in addition to the local, is actually important for Armenia. Maybe it's an unpopular statement, but it's not in defense. It doesn't mean that some certain abuses have to be tolerated. There are ways how to work around those things. But the large businesses is important for the simple point of, if you remember the map, of the scale. A small business, I mean, yes, I teach in the textbook that we are talking about perfect competitive model, but the word model betrays already that it's a very hypothetical setup. In reality, a small business cannot just, again, what we need right now is effect of scale in the case of Armenia. And the large business can bring that scale in. How that's regulated, that's a different question. How the small businesses work around it is also something that has to be worked on differently. So if you want to compare it to South Korea, that's exactly how South Korea became South Korea. It was very much government protected, autocratic, with military coups, executions, very serious stuff that doesn't really happen in Armenia to the scale it happened over there. Yet that some of you have LG or something, Samsung phones. So another important point is to realize from where it started and where it is now. In fact, these two lines, right? So the circle is Armenia and the triangle is Georgia. Georgia in the Soviet times was at a higher income levels, and both countries experienced some type of conflict. In the case of Georgia, civil war. In the case of Armenia, earthquake and another war. So the declines were significant, but notice that Georgia's fall was much more severe than Armenia's. And this is the effect of the 2008 crisis, and it's delayed effect. And so more or less tracking together, there's a small difference, but relatively together. In terms of growth, Armenia grew faster in the early decade, in the earlier part of 2000s, but slower at a slower rate much more recently, approaching Georgia's growth rate. But again, this is part from, not in the book, but it's from a chapter that I'm doing on, they call it transitional periphery. And so they have discussions on smaller countries, and mine is the only one on Armenia and Georgia. I'll skip this. I presented this somewhere else, basically, so not just give me 5 more minutes of your patience. In terms of how would we conceptualize what could be other than non-technical factors in the case of Armenia, and the change in economic base and social transformation. So we all are for progressive and social change. So definitely that's the human capital for me. So investment as much as possible in education, not for the purpose of degree, but more of applied professions, again, science, fundamental science, because in the long term, it's the research and development, it's the work that, again, not flattering, but that's the work that engineers do and then can think of, is what can be the foundation of a strong economy. Right? There's the obviously foreign direct investment, but for Armenia, over 60% of that investment is diaspora driven. If it wasn't for people in this room and others making contacts and so on, even that would not be coming to Armenia. It's different in Georgia because of the geographic location, primarily. It's a transit zone for pipelines, whatever types, but it also has the port system and access to the sea, right? So you have to use what you have, what makes you disadvantaged, you have to change it to use it to your advantage. That's why I'm emphasizing education. Trade related to this, diaspora, and then diaspora also brings the institutional change. So we'll see how things transform. Okay, very quickly, the long view. Again, they were all the same and we're all happy, but once they split up, they've all become very different and unhappy in their own way. There is a lot of wisdom in the classical literature, so this is how I view this. There's 3 directions in terms of country development, which we got to think about and also apply to specific country cases we're interested in. And this is kind of generalizing the literature. So social welfare, we want everyone to be employed, happy, and so on. Institutional change, rule of law, competitiveness, the social norms in the society, and so on. And then competitive structure is the actual industrial base or economic base, whatever it might be. It would be fantastic if high tech would be the industrial base for Armenia. For now, it's mining, okay, and it's the gold and whatever is being found there every day. So, what these arrows are showing, they're supposed to be Hegelian spirals, if anyone is familiar with philosophy, which means that they don't have to be as perfect as I have them here, which means you can have improvements in institutions and improvements in competitive structure, but not so much in the social welfare. Let's see. Even in the case of Eastern European countries, there's visible improvement in the economic sense, right? In Hungary, in Poland, their economy is resilient, there's growth. But social welfare is kind of strange because it looks like inequality indexes are rising, and there's also some tension with the European Union on a lot of the issues that are very urgent. For example, considering the migrant situation. Or the other way around, you could have very strong economy, relatively good development in social sort of living standards, but very weak, to put it mildly, in institutional case. And the best example is from history is the Hitler's Germany, of course. Everyone, it seemed that way, right? It's one of those examples. So what was the meaning of this whole transition? Was the end goal? I learned to ask this question on my recent trip to Armenia this summer. What is it that we're trying to achieve? Was the end goal to achieve the income level of rich countries? That's this arrow here. That's the rich country's income level. Roughly $40,000 a year. In converted dollars, whatever, but it's all consistent. Well, if that was the goal, none of them achieved this goal other than the Czech Republic, which is heavily integrated into the German economy. And then you can see others, Armenia is right here, and this is Georgia. So a big step, big gap away from the ideals. In terms of inequality, I mentioned that earlier. Well, it's not that everyone has to receive the same income, but egalitarian, more or less, equitable distribution means that there are no significant gaps. But what we're seeing across all of these countries is that pretty much all of them, anything in dark blue and light blue, means that it's the smallest share of population that controls the largest income in those countries. So again, if we want to think as we usually do in the Armenian circles, that we're exclusive, we're not. There are a lot of countries that are experiencing similar problems, so maybe we can see and learn something from there. My conclusion, that's what it is that everything here that I presented is interesting, but it was unprecedented change. In fact, what these countries are enjoying now, the freedoms that they're enjoying, the levels of income, even though they're below the 1989 levels, the sort of the capacity that's building up isn't precedented. In fact, it's accidental in many ways. Up until most of the 20th century and before that, pretty much all of them belonged to one empire or another. It was the Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that was pretty much carved entire Europe and Central Asia, right? And then the Persian Empire. So it's really unique that they're all independent now, and they're experimenting with their economies. It's something to appreciate as well. So shock therapy, which was the economic reform of the 90s, I would say was not a trigger. Or it was a trigger rather, but was not the culprit, right? It was not the sort of the cause necessarily. It was the structure, the historical structure that was kind of relatively weak. And then the moment it was pushed, the collapse was inevitable. Now, let's see. Let's keep this one. I think. No, I don't have it, but okay. So my kind of another summary to this is that we have to appreciate this variety. When I talked to people in Detroit, that's what I was looking for. I said, let's not think about the country as a Barbie doll that we're dressing up and trying to make it look pretty. Especially from the distance, it's very easy to do so. There are certain realities, and that's the difficult part. So the reality is that the past is debatable, just like the share of high tech. It's difficult to accept. The future is always full of promise. So the only challenge is the present. So thank you for your attention. I hope I've been in time.
You're okay.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
You mentioned a couple of times about how, for instance, South Korea became South Korea through and war protections to others, and how if Armenia's farm industry were subject to open borders, they would be completely developed. Are you advocating that Armenia utilize more, have more trade restrictions or have a more closed-off economy while it's developing for a better long-term?
I think that's what I'm saying is in parallel with what you said. I think that the weakness, or what we see as a weakness, Armenia could use it to its advantage. So you
because it's kind of closed off.
Yeah.
We could actually develop more.
Right.
Like Egypt, for instance, was an open market and it kind of destroyed everything.
Right. So that's the opportunity, right? And I'm not advocating closed borders. Okay. I'm all for the world. I think one of the greatest achievements of the 1990s is that people are able to travel, and there are more open borders. And in fact, we don't need any borders. But we're not the ones creating the situation, so we can only analyze it. And then from that perspective, it would make sense to strengthen agriculture and kind of, okay, so agriculture could be, Armenia has that advantage compared to other countries. It can reroute agriculture to the Eurasian market. IT is rerouted towards the English-speaking world market. And those things are doable, and Armenia's unique position in having those two agreements allows them to do that. So, but it takes time. Yes?
You mentioned that improving or increasing the technology distribution out of Armenia could potentially drive up the GDP to higher levels. What do you think is the highest factor that could increase that? And is there something in place right now that's helping drive?
Well, from what I know, there are those centers, and somebody who's probably more knowledgeable, Cuomo and others, that help develop some technical skills, but they're mostly with young people. Armenia has strong capacity, again, the human capital, the strong capacity in bilingual, trilingual specialists who are looking for jobs, interesting jobs. And high tech does not have to be just programming. I work in the field of macroeconomic analysis and policy. I look for economic reports, and these things, again, I may not have the best imagination, but these type of things could be produced out of Armenia and then distributed worldwide. So whatever the soft skills that are that can travel across the internet, all of that can be developed. Now, I know there are attempts that are being done, but there needs to be an educational base for people to be able to transition from one to another. Hold on to somebody else.
So you mentioned something about unprecedented for Armenian like at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union throughout the 1990s when they experienced a lot of economic difficulties. So do you think that today, eventually, thinking about that, thinking back off that, do you think that Armenia would today and Armenians in general would feel less threatened to much more tangible, comprehensive, institutional, and economic transformation into a market economy than they were in the 90s?
What do you mean less threat?
Well, because I think,
Just clarify a little bit.
by that time, you said that there was a lot of unprecedents going on in the science, and they didn't
Right.
understand. Like, and as soon as it happened, they didn't know exactly how to find themselves, and that's what kind of they weren't prepared to face this change, and that's when they
Right.
went through this.
I see what you mean. Yeah, so I think now, yes, definitely. I mean, they, despite, again, everything, the perception and some of the reality in terms of what we hear and corruption and all those related issues, Armenia's economy very much is a market economy with a lot of price mechanism aspects already in play. It may not be Norway, it's not France, but it is on its own scale. And so, plus there's the will in the society to transform things. Right? The only thing I'm saying is that there has to be clear realization that great things do not happen overnight. It takes time, and that's why even the large business would be important because it operates on that international export scale, and that's important to retain. While gradually maybe making it smaller and smaller, that's fading and phasing it out.
So, with that in mind, are we talking about the need for a godfather for Armenia or some sort of Marshall Plan that would give it the boost and sort of maintain it while it's trying to get there?
I lived long. I'm not gonna say this.
No, say it
But
anyway.
I do believe having a godfather helps in life in general.
Well, the help is real.
But a plan developed by Armenian economists for Armenia is what's needed for sure.
But they're here and they want to be out here. So somehow they've got to get there. And I'm having difficulty
Yeah.
seeing how a small IT
Right.
segment is going to go from here to there, and what's going to happen in the interim.
So
Or same thing with agriculture, and,
it all comes to financing and getting the money,
well,
right?
Godfather.
So you have to, but then you have some real politics, right? You have to realize the reality of politics, and if that's what you're trying to get to. My opinion is that for the purpose of local economic development, there's enough talent within Armenia already working in, let's say, private corporations, the banking system, who can develop such model and come up with meaningful solutions for the domestic market to grow. Because at the end of the day, what needs to grow is the domestic consumer market, so that people should feel comfortable to go to stores and buy, and there's local production to some degree. It doesn't mean that Armenia has to be fully sustainable. In fact, if we think about it, that shouldn't be the case for any of the countries. You always want to have something that somebody else wants to buy from you, and you want to buy something from them. The difference is in the value, right? Relative value. So hopefully we're producing something more relative value, higher value. The difficult question is kind of jump-starting all those industries, right? So 5 million years ago, I wrote a paper on diaspora bond. I was not the first one. Somebody wrote something similar 10 million years ago about that. But now this question has become another kind of point of discussion. And it may not be a bond, what Israel had as a diaspora bond, where and continues to be, where money goes into the infrastructure development, roads, bridges, full transparency, and so on. It's a financial instrument which is offered with the SEC supervision, so it comes with New York law. For example, in the first issue, something like out of 20 billion, if I remember the numbers correctly, but it was a large proportion, but something like out of 20 billion, 90 billion was not redeemed. People just took the certificates and put them in the frame on the wall.
Right.
If we can have that effect in Armenia, then that's great, but I'm not sure. It's problematic. So the question is to be realistic. This could be the goal. Okay, that's the bright future. But the present is you have to step by step move towards the goal. That's where there needs to be a coherent economic program.
Okay.
Yes.
One more question. The diaspora is viewed as a cash cow.
Okay.
We've been doing that for 28 years or 27 years. It will not stop. But in your mind, what's the role of the diaspora besides providing the cash? What else the diaspora should do to help Armenia grow?
We should do more. I think it's already doing a lot. It has a transformative nature. So that's another subject that I've researched a bit and have written on. And the transformative nature is just basically you going there and giving a talk. And that's already making a change in one person's life, and that's already a lot. When we go there, so economists from here, we're being asked to just talk to students, not even in lecture. And for them, it's a new learning experience. And I'm sure you agree that stimulates certain brain activity that later we don't even know what the effect will be. So that's me at the micro level, seeing the value of this. But of course, there are big, grand projects. And what the diaspora brings with it is also the attitude. And I think that's what's really critical. The change in the attitude, that for some reason there are all these people coming to Armenia and still, despite all odds and all sorts of known complications, still try to make it there. I think or maybe I kind of self-deceive myself into thinking that gives another another source of strength to the society, and then that becomes the economy. What the diaspora really should do, though, is to be more active internally in its communities, to educate local communities about the complexity of Armenia. When I used to organize a lot of these events 10, 15 years ago, one of the problems was I would run into kind of other events that were very much on the extremes, right? But today we have, let's say, so recently there was Armenian Bar Association events, and that was quite interesting because they covered so many different topics. And it was, so I did not attend, but what I was teaching, I'm sorry, but what I could see sort of from the reports was general discussion, and that's what we need more of. It should not be just about the highlights, the bullet points of history and culture that we know, but it should be more general conversation, but on an informed level. So, work more. You guys are very curious.
No, I just wanted to add that I think just what they can do more, the diaspora and the government, they can promote more, industrialization in terms of technology or anything else. Promote companies within Armenia that, because right now I think a lot of sourcing is foreign and people actually work, make money, but actually they can create companies in Armenia. I think that would significantly impact the economy. So if they can promote that and give them some flexibility and give them some treats for that.
There is some efforts on that to kind of help, but it's from the Armenian government side to bring the diaspora businesses. I think for anyone under 35, they have an idea there's financing available. So I guess more kind of open discussion of these things.
A couple of points. How many people have questions still? 1, 2, 3. Okay, we're gonna limit it to 3 more questions. We have to vacate the room at 7:45, so.
Okay. All right, please.
I have a question and also a comment with a statement. I'm
Not
an
a comment, but a
economist.
statement.
Yeah, I'm an economist, and then I did my career in technology, so I'm in both ways. And I'm going, actually flying to Armenia tomorrow for the next 2 weeks to be there on 2 projects. One is meeting with all ministers in Armenia to talk about the technology global hub that will include diaspora, include all the scientists, all the knowledgeable people in technology, in business, worldwide, not only. It was
Okay,
so
okay.
exciting.
I'm listening.
No, go ahead.
I'm with you. Okay, excited.
The second one is in Armenia, there are actually at least 5 to 6 global conferences that happen, and half of them are related to technology. The one that I'm going to speak at, it's a global forum related to artificial intelligence and biochemistry. And the largest technology conference is going to happen in Armenia in 2019. Buy the tickets next October. Find out, because be there and then really learn. So I'm actually proposing that why are we not saying Armenia has to not go slowly? It's only 3 million. It's very small economy. And then if we collect 12 million Armenians with all the knowledge and money, not only money, and personality and the desire, we can actually do 10x. Why are we not talking about that?
You can do
Question
what?
to
I'm
you.
sorry.
10x growth.
Okay.
10x.
Okay. There's another conference that's going on, Hive, right now?
Hive was on Saturday.
Yeah.
It was actually the venture capital. Nina, we were actually competing. How many people will come to our conference? Armin and I were organizing it. And we did speak a lot. We're actually organizers of the
We've already had
Armenian Bar
10% growth,
Association.
right? And then more than 10% growth it impressed economists at the World Bank so much, they called Armenia the Caucasian tiger. There's a report.
Oh, why are you saying it now?
We've always had, but your point on gathering the diaspora potential, it's also kind of, it's a good point. I agree, and I'm the first one who would say that. But it's already been tried many, many times and continues to be tried.
That's just giving money. I'm talking about doing business.
No.
Yeah.
Well, doing business as well. For example, doing business, for some reason, diasporans want to come tell me that some businessmen might have told me, once we get the guarantees that we have our business, that we can open our business in Armenia, then we'll go there. And the guarantee has to come from the government.
Okay, give me those questions. I'm meeting with all the ministers tomorrow, next week.
So, and I did my, yeah, I'll get 7:45. I got it. I recently completed a diaspora survey, which was maybe some of you have seen it online. I have the answers. I haven't published them yet, but there's a lot of massive potential. People are saying, I'm poor, but I'm an engineer, or I'm sorry, but I'm a scientist, I can do this and that. If you give me a Skype connection, I'll teach people, right? So there's a lot of response, there's a lot of interest in the diaspora. It's all a matter about how to organize it. So for a very long time, when in the 90s, late 90s, 2000s, everyone was very naive and enthusiastic, we were thinking about systemic mechanism for diaspora to participate in Armenia. But I'm thinking the diversity, this dispersion is actually the strength. As long as there's overall framework, which says, whichever it might be, Minister of Diaspora, and say you're interested in hosting a conference, you click on a button on the website and there's all the information you need, you move in and you feel confident that that's how it works. But okay, we had the question.
Yeah, so I had a question. You showed like a chart where it showed Armenia and Georgia, they were about 15% of migration after the Soviet Union collapsed. So I was wondering if you could just touch on that a little more, and if there wasn't such heavy migration out of those countries, do you think the economy could have been better off?
Okay, so migration is a touchy subject, and it's touchy for many reasons. One is that it's obviously can be made political, but another it's economic. And in economic terms, both countries lost a significant share of population.